The theater was already alive before he ever stepped onto the stage. Lights swept across the massive AGT arena like waves, bouncing off thousands of eager faces. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, people whispering guesses, judges flipping through notes, cameras gliding smoothly into position. Everyone expected spectacle, big voices, big stories, big personalities, and then he walked out, no dramatic entrance, no confident stride, no rehearsed smile, just a man-average height, slightly hunched shoulders, hands clasped together as if holding something fragile. His jacket was simple, worn at the elbows. His shoes looked like they'd walked many miles, not stages. He paused for half a second under the lights, blinking as though the brightness surprised him. For a moment, the audience didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't young, he wasn't flashy, he didn't look like someone chasing fame. In fact, he looked like someone who almost turned around backstage and went home. The camera zoomed in, his eyes told a different story. They carried something heavy, years of quiet responsibility, sleepless nights, and memories that don't fade easily. There was nervousness there, yes, but beneath it was something stronger, purpose. A judge leaned forward. "So, what's your name?" He cleared his throat before answering, his voice soft but steady. He said his name, followed by a small, apologetic smile, as if he didn't want to take up too much space in the room. "And why are you here today?" another judge asked. The question hung in the air. Most contestants answered quickly. Dreams, fame, a lifelong passion. But this man hesitated. His fingers tightened together. He took a breath, not the kind you take before singing, but the kind you take before telling the truth. "I promised someone I would," he said. That was it. No speech, no backstory, just one sentence. The audience leaned in, sensing there was more. The judge raised an eyebrow gently. "Who did you promise?" The man's lips pressed together. His jaw tightened for just a moment before he spoke again. "My brother." Something shifted in the room. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. The kind that makes people sit up straighter without realizing why. Another judge asked softly, "And what are you going to sing for us today?" He swallowed. "Elvis." The reaction was instant. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. A few murmurs, a few skeptical smiles. Elvis Presley was sacred territory. Legends weren't easily touched, especially not on a stage where comparison was inevitable. One judge tilted their head. "Elvis is a bold choice." The man nodded slowly. "I know." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no bravado, just honesty. As the band prepared, the camera caught his hands trembling slightly. He noticed, and steadied them against his jacket. He glanced toward the audience, scanning faces he'd never seen before, faces filled with curiosity, doubt, hope. In his mind, the noise faded. Suddenly, he wasn't in a massive arena anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. A small, dimly lit hospital room, the quiet hum of machines, a chair pulled close to a bed. He remembered how Elvis used to play softly from an old speaker, how his brother would smile even on the hardest days, how music became the one thing illness couldn't steal. The man shifted his weight on the stage, grounding himself. This wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about judges or votes or applause. It was about keeping a promise. The music cue was ready. The spotlight narrowed, wrapping him in a warm glow that felt almost protective. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause, like the world itself was holding its breath. He closed his eyes. The audience noticed. There was a stillness in that simple act, a vulnerability. He wasn't preparing to perform. He was preparing to remember. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman clasped her hands together. A man leaned forward, elbows on knees. Even the judges, seasoned by thousands of auditions, felt something unfamiliar stirring. Expectation had quietly turned into curiosity. Who was this man? What had he lost? And why did choosing Elvis matter so much? As the first note approached, his chest rose with a deep, steady breath, the kind that comes from resolve, not confidence. This was not the beginning of a performance. This was the beginning of a story, and no one in that arena, not the judges, not the audience, not even the man himself, could have imagined how profoundly still the world was about to become. Before the first note ever reached the arena, The song had already been sung 100 times in whispered hospital rooms, in parked cars late at night, in moments when hope felt dangerously thin. As the band waited, the man stood still beneath the lights, eyes closed, breathing slowly. To the audience it looked like nerves, but inside him, memory was doing what it always did, pulling him backward. Years ago his life was much simpler. He and his younger brother had grown up in a small home where money was tight, but laughter was loud. Their father worked long hours, their mother did her best to keep the family together, and through it all, music filled the gaps. Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer in their house, he was tradition. Sunday mornings meant vinyl records. Long drives meant cassette tapes. Bad days meant Elvis turned up just a little louder. His brother loved Elvis most of all, not because of the fame or the costumes, but because Elvis sang like he understood struggle. Like he'd lived it, like he knew what it meant to fall and still get back up. Then came the diagnosis. It arrived quietly, disguised as fatigue, a cough that wouldn't go away, doctor visits that stretched from weeks into months. And then one afternoon a word that changed everything: cancer. The man remembered how the room felt smaller after that, how time sped up and slowed down all at once. His brother, once so full of energy, became thinner, quieter. Strong days became rare gifts. Weekdays became the norm, but the music stayed. Every evening after work the man would visit the hospital. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in silence, and sometimes, when words felt useless, he sang. Not because he was a singer, not because he was good, but because it was the only thing that made his brother smile. He sang Elvis, softly at first, afraid of disturbing other patients, then louder, when nurses paused outside the door just to listen. His brother would close his eyes, tapping a finger against the blanket, pretending, for a few minutes, that life was normal again. Those moments mattered more than either of them admitted. As weeks passed, the doctor's optimism faded. Treatments became harsher, nights became longer. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, his brother reached for his hand. "Promise me something," he said. The man laughed nervously. "You'll be fine. You don't need, promise me," his brother repeated. There was a seriousness in his eyes that silenced every excuse. One day, his brother said, "You're going to stand on a big stage, like AGT, and you're going to sing Elvis." The man shook his head instantly. "No way, I'm not you. I can't. You don't have to be perfect." His brother interrupted. "Just be real." That night the promise was made. Months later, the hospital room was quieter than it had ever been. The machine slowed, the conversation stopped, and when it was over, the man walked out of that building carrying something invisible but heavy, grief mixed with guilt, love mixed with unfinished sentences. Life moved on as it always does. He went back to work, paid bills, smiled when expected, but the music stopped. Elvis records gathered dust. Singing became too painful, each note a reminder of what was lost. Years passed, then one night, while flipping through channels, he stopped on AGT, the stage lights, the applause, the stories, and suddenly the promise came rushing back. He tried to ignore it, told himself it was foolish. Too late, too risky, too embarrassing, but some promises don't fade, they wait. The application sat on his kitchen table for weeks. Every time he walked past it, he heard his brother's voice, "Just be real." Eventually, with shaking hands, he filled it out. Now, standing on the AGT stage, the man felt all of that weight pressing against his chest. The past wasn't behind him. It was standing right there, listening. The band signaled they were ready. He opened his eyes slowly. The judges waited. The audience waited. Millions would eventually watch. But in his mind, there was only one person who mattered: his brother. He remembered how scared he used to be singing in that hospital room. How his voice would crack, how he'd mess up lyrics, and how none of that mattered. Because love doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. As the first chord began to play, his heart pounded, not with fear, but with recognition. This was where the promise led, not to fame, not to victory, to honesty. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. The song wasn't just Elvis anymore. It was memory, it was loss, it was love refusing to disappear. Before a single word left his mouth, Something inside him settled. Whatever happened next, whatever the judges said, whatever the crowd decided, he had already won something far greater. He was keeping his promise, and the moment his voice was about to rise, the entire arena stood on the edge of something unexpected, a song not meant to impress, but to heal. The first note left his lips almost as a whisper. Not polished, not powerful, just real. It floated into the vast arena like a fragile thing, unsure whether it would survive the distance. For a brief moment no one reacted. The audience had heard thousands of auditions, some brilliant, some forgettable. This sounded different. Then the second line came. His voice trembled, but it didn't collapse. It carried weight, like someone lifting something heavy, not with strength, but with determination. The band followed gently, careful not to overpower him, as if they sensed this song needed space to breathe. A judge shifted in their chair. Something about his tone wasn't chasing applause. It wasn't asking for approval. It was offering something, quietly, humbly, without expecting anything in return. The camera moved across the crowd. A young woman in the front row slowly lowered her phone. A man crossed his arms, then uncrossed them, leaning forward without realizing it. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the restless energy that usually pulsed through the room seemed to fade. This wasn't an Elvis impersonation. This was an interpretation. As he reached the chorus, his voice grew steadier. Not louder, but fuller. The kind of fullness that comes when someone stops performing and starts telling the truth. Each word landed softly, yet firmly, like it belonged there. He opened his eyes. The lights blurred slightly through the moisture gathering in them, but he didn't look away. He stared straight ahead, past the judges, past the audience, towards something only he could see. A hospital bed, a familiar smile, a promise waiting to be kept. His voice cracked on a note he'd hit perfectly 1,000 times in practice. The arena gasped. For half a second, it sounded like he might stop. His shoulders lifted as he caught his breath. The microphone picked up the quiet inhale. The kind singers are trained to hide, but he didn't stop. He leaned into the crack, and that's when everything changed. The imperfection became the most powerful part of the song. It stripped away any remaining doubt. This wasn't rehearsed emotion. This was pain meeting courage in real time. One of the judges pressed a hand to their mouth. Another judge, known for brutal honesty, blinked rapidly and looked away, pretending to adjust something on the desk. The band softened even more, almost retreating into the background, allowing his voice to stand alone, unprotected, unhidden. By the second verse, the arena was completely still. No clapping, no whispering, no movement. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with shared emotion. Thousands of strangers breathing together, connected by a man and a song. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to cry quietly, then another and another. The man on stage felt it, not as noise but as energy, a warmth spreading outward then returning to him. For the first time since his brother's passing, he didn't feel alone with the memory. As he reached the final chorus, his voice rose, not in volume but in resolve. Each word felt like a letter sent across time, addressed to someone he loved and lost. He wasn't trying to sound like Elvis. He was singing with him, borrowing the strength of a voice that had once helped him survive the worst days of his life. The last note approached. He held it longer than planned, not because he wanted drama, but because letting go felt too final. His chest tightened, his eyes closed again, just for a moment, and then silence. The note faded naturally, gently, like it didn't want to disturb the air it had changed. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. Not the judges, not the audience, not even the camera crew. Time had stopped. Then someone stood, one person, then another, then a wave. The applause didn't explode. It rose slowly, respectfully, like a standing ovation at a memorial rather than a show. Hands clapped through tears, faces glowed with recognition. The man remained still, head bowed slightly, hands at his sides. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was listening, listening to the sound of a promise fulfilled. When he finally looked up, he saw it. The judges on their feet, the audience standing as one, the arena transformed into something sacred. He exhaled deeply, the tension leaving his body all at once. His hands shook again, but this time not from fear. From release. Whatever happened next didn't matter. In that moment, he had given something honest to the world, and the world had received it without judgment. The song had ended, but its echo remained. And the AGT arena, so often loud and unforgiving, had learned how to be still. The applause didn't fade quickly. It rolled through the arena like a living thing, slow at first, then growing, wrapping itself around the man on stage. He stood there, frozen, as if moving might shatter what had just happened. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them away. He wasn't used to being seen like this. When the applause finally softened, one of the judges leaned forward, voice gentler than the world knew them for. "Thank you for that." 2 words, but they carried more respect than any standing ovation. Another judge spoke next. That didn't feel like a performance, it felt like a conversation. The man nodded slowly. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He swallowed, steadying himself, the microphone catching the faint hitch in his breath. The judge continued carefully. "Who were you singing to?" The question landed softly, but it landed deep. The man looked down at the stage floor as if the answer was written there. His fingers tightened again, the same way they had earlier, only now there was no fear left in the gesture. Just emotion searching for words. "My brother," he said. The single word echoed through the quiet arena. He lifted his head and looked out, no longer trying to hold himself together. He used to sit in a hospital bed and ask for Elvis. The man continued, "On the worst days, especially on the worst days." The audience leaned in again, not with curiosity this time, but with care. "He passed away," the man said. He paused, not for effect, but because his voice needed time to catch up with his heart. Before he did, "He made me promise I'd come here one day and sing." The judges exchanged glances. One of them pressed their lips together, fighting emotion. "I didn't think I ever would." The man admitted, "I'm not brave. I'm not a performer. I'm just someone who loved his brother." His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of years finally setting down. "But tonight," he said quietly, "I felt like he was here." Something broke open in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. A judge stood again, this time placing a hand over their heart. "You know," they said, voice unsteady, "we see a lot of talent on this stage, but what you gave us, that was humanity." Another judge nodded. "You reminded us why music exists." The third judge, usually quick with critique, said nothing at first. They simply looked at the man with an expression that said everything words couldn't. Then they spoke. "My mother loved Elvis," they said. "She used to play his songs when life was hard, and tonight, you brought her back to me for a moment. Thank you." The audience reacted, not with cheers, but with something warmer, a shared understanding, the knowledge that everyone there had lost someone, loved someone, held on to something through music. The host stepped closer, sensing the moment wasn't over. "Do you believe your brother heard you tonight?" they asked. The man smiled through tears for the first time. "I know he did." The host nodded slowly. "Then I think you did exactly what you came here to do." The votes came next, but they felt almost unnecessary. One by one, the judges said yes, not just to his performance, but to his presence, to his story, to the courage it took to stand in front of the world and be honest. When the final yes was spoken, the crowd erupted, this time loud, joyful, and full. Confetti didn't fall, music didn't blare, it didn't need to. The man brought a hand to his face, overwhelmed. He shook his head softly, laughing through tears, as if he still couldn't believe where he was standing. As he left the stage, the judges watched him go with quiet respect, not because he'd impressed them, but because he'd changed them. Backstage, away from the lights, the man paused. The noise from the arena was muffled now, distant. He leaned against a wall and closed his eyes. "Did you hear that?" He whispered to no one and everyone at once. For the first time in years, the pain didn't feel so heavy, because compassion, shared openly, has a way of transforming grief into something gentler, something that connects rather than isolates. Out there, in the arena, Thousands of people had carried his story with him, and in doing so, they had quietly healed a part of themselves too. The truth had been revealed, and it had done exactly what truth does best. It brought people together. The lights of the AGT stage eventually dimmed, but the moment didn't end there. Long after the applause faded and the cameras moved on, something invisible continued to ripple outward, quietly, steadily, carrying a man's song far beyond the walls of the arena. That night, as he walked out into the cool air, the noise of the city felt distant. He stood for a moment beneath the stars, breathing deeply, letting the reality of what had happened settle into his bones. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Messages from strangers poured in, people who didn't know his name, yet somehow knew his heart. "I lost my brother too. That song helped me breathe tonight. Thank you for reminding me why music matters." He read them slowly, one by one, his hands trembling, not from fear anymore, but from awe. For years, grief had felt like something private, isolating. But now he realized it had connected him to thousands of people he'd never meet. He went home and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photographs, a hospital wristband, and an Elvis cassette tape, worn thin from love. He held it carefully, like something sacred. Instead of pain, a soft warmth filled his chest. For the first time, the memories didn't hurt. They healed. In the days that followed, the clip spread everywhere. Social media, morning shows, group chats between people who hadn't spoken in years. The comments weren't about technique or perfection, they were about connection. He sang for all of us. That's what love sounds like. "I called my brother after watching this." The man watched quietly from the sidelines. He didn't chase attention. He didn't try to explain the moment. He let it belong to everyone. One afternoon, he received a letter from a children's hospital. A nurse wrote that after his performance aired, families began playing Elvis songs in the hallways. Parents sang, kids laughed. For a moment the building felt lighter. He read the letter twice, then pressed it to his chest. That was the real victory. Weeks later, he was invited back to the AGT stage, not to compete, but to share. He stood there again, under the same lights, but this time his posture was different. He wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. "I used to think singing was about being heard," he said to the audience. "Now I know it's about listening, to each other, to our memories, to the people we've loved." Somewhere in the crowd, people held hands. He continued, "If you're holding onto something heavy, you don't have to carry it in silence. Sometimes sharing it is the bravest thing you can do." That night he sang again, and once again the arena stood still. But this time it wasn't because of grief, it was because of hope. After the show, he visited a small park near his home. He sat on a bench as the sun dipped below the horizon, guitar resting beside him, something he'd avoided for years. He strummed softly, letting the notes float into the evening air. He imagined his brother sitting beside him, smiling, tapping along like he always had. "I kept the promise," he whispered, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like an ending. They felt like a beginning. The man began volunteering, singing at hospitals, community centers, and places where people needed reminding that they weren't alone. He never charged, never promoted, he just showed up. And every time he sang Elvis, someone cried, someone smiled, someone remembered. The song had become bigger than him. It had become a bridge. Years later, people would still talk about that audition, not as the night someone sang Elvis, but as the night an arena learned how powerful kindness could be, how a simple promise, kept with love, could change lives, how one voice, honest and unafraid, could remind the world of its own humanity. And somewhere, in every person who heard that song, something softened. Because when he chose Elvis, he didn't just honor his brother. He honored every story of love that refuses to fade. And that is how the song lives on.